Hi, this is Misha, and it felt like time to drag out some French firearms again. And today I wanted to talk about the story of the Model 1935 and the subsequent Model 1950, just because they're so closely related it wasn't worth doing two separate videos. So here we have the original 1935A, manufactured by SACM. We have the model 1935S, manufactured by Mac. And both of these are in a unique cartridge, 7.65 Longue, or 7.65 by 20. And here we have the 1950, also manufactured by Mac. And this is in 9x19 Parabellum, today known as 9x19 NATO. So this is an interesting story. During World War I, France had a standard issue sidearm that was a revolver. It was the Model 1892, firing an 8mm cartridge. Pretty typical revolver for that day and time. It wasn't a loading gate. It did have a swing out cylinder. It was double action. So for a revolver, it was modern, except its 8mm cartridge was pretty underwhelming, which is not uncommon for revolvers from the late 19th century, the early days of smokeless powder. But this wasn't, even though it was standard, really France used a lot of 32 caliber 7.65 Browning guns, the Ruby being the most famous, but also the 1907 Savage and several others. So really they used more little guns during World War I, and this trend continued after, through the 20s and 30s. And by the 1930s, they had probably over a dozen different handguns in service, chambered for different cartridges, namely 7.65mm Browning, and a few older ones in the 8mm revolver round, ordnance round. But it was a really big hodgepodge. So the idea was, since the military was trying to modernize, they were trying to adopt a self-loading rifle. They were updating old labels to the R35 carbine. They were still working with the Berthier, sometimes trying to chamber it for the new 7.5 cartridge and other things. They were just doing their best to modernize because, Nazi Germany was on the rise. So in 1935, they began trials to select a new standard service sidearm. And several companies submitted designs, including one that's very famous today, FN Herstel of Belgium, submitted what we know as the high power, known at the time as the P35. And actually this is why the high power has a magazine disconnect safety. It was one of the many requirements for the French gun that they were testing out. Obviously the high power didn't win. It would have been great for France if it had. Instead, after 2 years, in 1937, they selected this gun here. Manufactured, I'm not going to attempt the French, by SACM, or I should say designed by SACM. This was adopted as the Model 1935-A. The design is really the brainchild of Charles Petter, a Swiss designer. It's a pretty typical gun. It uses a Browning style tipping barrel if you will. It's manual release. It is single action, exposed hammer. It does have that magazine disconnect safety that they love so much, except it doesn't. Let's stop there. It fires from a very typical 8-round magazine, box style. We have a manual safety here. It flips up which is very interesting. It's literally a block on the hammer. You can actually still pull the trigger and let it go forward, and that's supposed to block it. The idea was with it flipped up, you would clearly see your safety was on, but in practice, I'm sure you can see a few issues with that. We have a Browning style release. It's a pretty typical gun. We also have a loaded chamber indicator up here. Pretty typical gun. Really, and this really is attributed to Petter. What makes this special is its grip. It has an extremely nice ergonomic grip. Nice checkered panels. Also, the fire control grip is removable as a single piece for maintenance or replacement, something you will see later in the Russian Tokarev. Actually, it was around the same time, truly, but concept. So the gun feels really good, even if it's not potentially a great service gun. It has a nice trigger, quite curvy. The whole grip is very curvy. The slide is very smooth. It's a nice feeling gun, and it's relatively small. Now, I'm going to point this at you. The point of this, though, is it's a .30 caliber. They didn't get away from that. It's still 7.65 long, which is a slightly larger .32, slightly longer case. It's kind of a take from the World War I era US .30 caliber Pedersen cartridge, meant to be fired as a semi-auto in the 1903. It's just not an especially powerful round. They went from 2 anemic rounds to yet another pretty anemic round. I mean, it's decent for self-defense. It's a little more powerful than .32. I mean, it's powerful enough that it really does need a locked breech, but not much of one. It's kind of analogous to 8mm Nambu. It's in that range of a little more powerful than the Browning cartridges, be it .32 or .380, but still not 9mm or 45, and certainly not 7.62 Tokarev. Anyway, this is what France went with, and they issued a contract for SACEM, and they waited. And SACEM had trouble going into production. This is where the 35S comes in. This was designed by MAS, Manufactured Arms Descent Eschen. Now, it's been said that this was a cheaper, more, mass-produced friendly version. It's not. This was another competitor in the trials. It lost out to the SACEM, but it was still a good design. It's very similar. Have about the same barrel length. It fires the 7.65 Longue cartridge. We still have the same style of removable trigger pack, polymer grips, same single action trigger system. It has a much more straight grip though, less ergonomic. It's fine, but it's not quite as nice. The hammer does stick up a little more though. Now this one has a safety, here you go, that flips up much like the SACM. This is a later revision we'll get to in a bit, so it's not original to the initial design. And the reason they went to this, MAS was a government arsenal factory, and when SACM was slow in delivering in 1938, they ordered some of the 35S's. So this became a substitute standard very quickly after the original 35A had been adopted. By 1939, the military was receiving its first 35As. And by the time France was overrun by Germany, about a little under 11,000 had been delivered, 10,000 and some change, like 10,700. So not an especially large number, but more than the 35S MAS was only able to deliver about 1,500 before the invasion. Then again, they were given they started off later, so it's a little bit excusable. But it seems like once SACM got up and running, they started to deliver them. But then Germans, which happened frequently in Europe. So we have two France firing the new cartridge at the time. Now during the war, MAS would actually mislay the designs for several of their guns, including this one here. So this was never produced under Nazi occupation. However, the 35A was, and so you can find several with Waffen amps. Of course, this received a German designation. I can't remember what it was right now, folks. I apologize. It was 600 something F, 625, 645 F. It doesn't really matter. It was numbers and letters. These are mostly issued to police and occupation forces in France. Obviously, firing a non-standard cartridge for Germany, it wasn't especially appreciated. So these were in production and use during World War II. And these were essentially just stuck back during that war. All right, stop there. Honestly, while the 35s, both of them here, the S and the A, were adopted several years before World War II, most of their use was after the war. As I said, SACM would continue manufacturing the A through the war and would continue post-war, building them to about 1950 and producing about 85,000 total. So a reasonably large number. These would see use, of course, in Indochina, Algeria, quite a bit through at least the 1960s. And they would see use by French police. The guns pretty much went unchanged. They had a paint over phosphate finish to help protect them in more tropical environments. Also, originally they didn't have a lanyard loop here. This was added supposedly for police use. This also was the very long ago inspiration for what we know today as the Swiss Sig P210, often thought of as the finest standard military issue mass production sidearm. What happened, Switzerland purchased a production right for these in 1937. In the beginning was basically making the exact gun, but by the time they were done in 1947, it's almost unrecognizable except for bits of the operating system and the grip shape a bit and the trigger. But nevertheless, this was the deep inspiration for that gun, so it has a little bit of lineage. That's kind of interesting. As for the S version, production was resumed after liberation in 1944. As I said, before the war, MAS had only delivered about 1,400 of these. They would make a little over 5,000 after the war for the next couple of years, bringing their total to about 6,700. Also, two other contractors would come online. You would have MF, Manufacture France, which would build 10,000, and Sagem, which would build another 10,000. So we have about 27,000, a little less, during the 44 to 46 period. And then MAC, Manufactured Arms Charleroi, would pick these up, and manufacture quite a large number. They would manufacture about 56,000 with production ending in the early 50s, around 52, 53. Also, the M1 revision we mentioned earlier would happen, where they would redo the safety to be more uniform with the A. And this would happen in 46. And most of the older guns were retrofitted. These could have either a phosphated finish, parkerized, or later a blued finish. And like the 35A, these would see extensive combat in Eastern Asia and Africa. And honestly, they proved to be a little more dependable, a little more durable, a little more reliable in adverse conditions, which isn't really surprising considering how kind of chunkier and a little more overbuilt, a little less elegant these are. Still a single action gun. And of course, both of these are still firing the relatively anemic 7.65 Longue cartridge. And that's where this gun comes in here. As early as 1946, France found itself in a similar situation where it had been 10-20 years earlier. It had a lot of handguns in inventory. A lot of them were captured from Germans or left behind. Some were American aid. And of course, some were just older guns. They had, of course, the 7.65 Longue cartridge. They had plenty of 7.65 Browning 32 guns around. They had 9mm Kurz guns, 380. They had 45 1911s. They had still some old revolvers. And of course, they had the German guns, which were mostly a 9mm. In fact, they kind of officially adopted the P38, what we know today as the Gray Ghost, his nickname, even manufacturing quite a large number of them, and we have a video on that. It's kind of a neat story because they ended up at the Mauser factory, but that was a temporary thing because they were basically building them using parts. So in the late 40s, they wanted to unify around a new cartridge, and this became 9mm Parabellum, 9x19, what we know today as 9mm NATO. This just was the logical choice. Now really first they worked on a submachine gun. This became the MAT 49, and we have a video on that as well. And after that they really got serious about a sidearm, starting to hold trials in 1950, and really kind of selecting this gun here by 1953. Now what the Model 1950 is, it's designed by MAC. It's basically a larger 35S. That's about it. It's larger for the 9mm round. We still have the same style of safety. We have the same single action trigger. Same box magazine styling, although this holds 9 cartridges because we have a longer grip. We have a magazine disconnect safety, which was a French thing. Click. Slide release. Same style of mag release here. We have a little bit more of an angle grip from the A. It's a little more curvy, a little more comfortable, but it is larger also. But the slide is very 35S styling, especially the sights. We have a loaded chamber indicator here. We have quite a long beaver tail back here. We've gone away from this kind of bottom mounted lanyard loop here to more of a recessed one, so it won't snag in the back here to clip a lanyard in. And we've gone away from checkered panels to these horizontally serrated panels, very P38-ish. I'm sure that was influenced by the P38, the Gray Ghost, because they are easier to clean and just more durable. The grip's a little more, it fills your hand. It's a more ergonomic gun than the 35S, I would say. But it's very no frills. Single action service gun, holding 9+1. These would go into production at MAC, who would build them until about 1963. Then MAS would take over. They would start to build them around 1961 and continue. It's hard to say exactly when because they would keep refurbishing older guns, but you're looking at least the late 60s, early 70s for new production. They produced quite a large number of these. They would actually build about 340 some odd thousand, so more than both the S and A combined. But France was combined with a post-war situation where they're not being invaded, and they also have many colonial wars, so they had a need of handguns, especially jungle fighting type things. So the production numbers aren't surprising. They also produced a large number of the MAT 49 submachine gun. It was a good gun, nothing extraordinary as I said, and it would remain in service standard issue through 1988, by which time it was replaced by a license-produced version of the Beretta 92G, so the decocker only version, known as the G1. And that was it. That's pretty much it. So it started off as nothing terribly revolutionary, and by the 80s when it was retired, it was pretty well antiquated. Of course, the US only retired the 1911 and 1985, so this was a little more modern than that. This gun proved itself to be very durable, very dependable, very easy to work on. We still have this removable kind of trigger. It did well in the tropics, in the deserts. It wasn't known for great accuracy. In fact, it was kind of known for not being very accurate. But then again, I've heard that about the MAT 49, so I have to wonder how good the French 9mm cartridges were at the time. Who knows? But it was a dependable, rugged, standard gun, and it was reasonably powerful. 9mm did the job. So they finally learned their lesson. They went away from these anemic guns to one that had a little more power to it. But pretty much all three of these are same exact operating system, same exact features. And really this is what they should have adopted in the first place. Even if they didn't want to go to the high power, a 9mm version in this series would have made a lot of sense. There's a little postscript to this gun's service history. In 2000, several were pulled out of stockpiles because they were having some trouble with the G1s. They were having some cracking, and so they pulled out some of the older 1950s and started to reissue them again. I'm kind of reminded of the the situation in Sweden with the Lottie M40 versus the Browning FN 1907. You saw a lot of this as older World War II guns and stuff wore out, and then they tried to get a new. Long story short, but it did have a little twilight career. And some of these are still in service today, especially with police and reserve units. They made a large number. Is to access in the USA, you can find the 35As, and especially for some reason, it seems like I've always found more 35Ss here. And they're made basically in the same numbers. And they're very inexpensive for the quality of gun you get, even pre-war examples, because of the obsolescent caliber they fire. Good luck finding 7.65 Longue. It's just not really accessible. Now the 1950 would probably be more popular, except there just aren't that many in the country. France never surplused and exported them like they did the So the only ones that came in were actually imported from elsewhere, from East Asia. I believe Interarms brought in a few hundred of these, including this one here. And that's officially it that came in. A few more came back from Vietnam, U.S. soldiers bringing them back as trophies. These are, often in pretty rough shape, at least externally. A lot of the finish is gone. And the one I saw the most, that a friend had for years, actually had Vietnamese grips. They were made of kind of ivory. I don't know if it was real or fake. Who knows with Vietnam. But it's kind of interesting. So even though this one's for a 1950 being hard to pick up in the U.S., I'm happy with it. At least it's original, hasn't been reworked or anything. And it's a fun little gun. It's unfortunate maybe one day some of these will actually come in numbers, but for now they're quite hard to find and really of only interest to French collectors. So they're not as expensive as other guns that are as rare as this are, just because of not a huge amount of interest. But for me, they really are. And it goes well with my other French guns. And that's about it. Like I said, we've done videos on other French guns, the self-loaders, the 4956, the CR39 is probably one of our most unique, as is the MAT 49. So click on the playlist. We've got a French firearms playlist. if you're interested. We'd appreciate that. Also, please feel free to share your own French pistols and about them in the comments. As always, if you liked the video, we'd appreciate a click there, a like there. And if you'd like to help support the channel a bit more, that is such a not a great safety. Please click on the link and check out our Patreon page. This is Misha. Nice trigger, it really is. And we'll catch you next time.